Eagles, always in the news here on 97.3 ESPN. It's our first chance on the Boardwalk Honda hotline to catch up with our next guest. That's Les Bowen from the Philadelphia Daily News. Les, did you get any time off between last season and this one?
Just a little, Pete, but it was such a nice ending to the season that I don't really mind.
Let's talk about that since we haven't spoken to you since the Super Bowl. The Eagles are the Super Bowl champions. Did you think that sentence would ever be uttered?
I certainly didn't think it'd be uttered this year. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. It really is.
What was the Minneapolis experience like for you? What stood out about that game for you? Obviously, the Philly special everybody knows, and the lack of defense until the key moment. Those are some of the highlights, I suppose. What stood out to you?
Well, when I think back on it, I think of spending a week at the mall in Bloomington, which is where everything was set up, the media facilities and both teams' hotels were there at the Mall of America. So we spent a lot of time wandering around the mall. And incredibly, and it was good in the sense that Minnesota is not really a go-to spot in February. It was like minus 25 with the wind chill a lot of the time. So the mall was
Les Bowen with us from the Philadelphia Daily News. Our connection must have dropped there in this first day of spring weather where we've got our nor'easter coming in. Definitely not feeling like spring here either, as Les is talking about the -4 conditions that we had at the Mall of America or in Minnesota and how cold it was on the Nicollet Mall. That was the outside mall. They had the outside mall and the inside mall. The inside mall, the Mall of America, was where the media headquarters were located and most of the press conferences were located. And then the Nicollet Mall was where they had the outside experiences. That's where you saw snowmobile jumping and ice carving and all the things that fit the 4-degree weather out there at the Nicollet Mall, which was not too far from the stadium where the Vikings play and the Super Bowl was held between the Eagles and the Patriots. So nevertheless, yes, the Eagles finally get back to the Super Bowl. They win the Super Bowl, but they don't necessarily do it in San Diego type weather or Florida type weather. They do it in -4-degree weather, and that Mall of America was the headquarters. Les Bowen back with us now. And Les, I was talking about the Nicollet Mall being the outside area. Did you make it out there at all, or did you stick on the inside?
No, I was pretty much in the Mall of America the whole week. In fact, we only got to Minneapolis like twice, including the game being one of those two times. But it was the game itself, Pete. The thing I recall the most is the fourth quarter and kind of realizing that there's a good chance this could happen. And because of deadlines, newspaper deadlines, having to write during that whole time and trying to sort of write something that made sense and would stand up to posterity, because people keep these papers,
Yes, they do.
When something like this happens, while at the same time taking in what was happening. I didn't even get so caught up in what I was writing that I didn't really remember, what the scene was like and how it happened. And it was just it was a strange evening. It really was.
Yeah, there's an art form to that of being able to write your own piece, watch the action, absorb the action, and then still stay on deadline. Curious, what time was your deadline for that night? Do you remember?
I had to get something in as soon as the game was over, and then I could rework it. And the reworked version ended up just going online, which I kind of felt bad about because, people didn't print out the story from online and keep that. What they kept was what was in the papers, the Inquirer and the Daily News, and that was the early version, which didn't really have quotes and stuff like that. But it was an amazing thing. The main thing I did long after everything was over, I went down to the field and scooped up a lot of confetti and stuffed it in my pockets to give to my kids and people around that I knew, my neighbors and so forth.
Yep, a smart move there. That was a very popular move. I saw a lot of people took the confetti with them because, hey, how often do you know? Although the way the offseason is going, and we'll segue into that, it does look like Howie's going for broke again. He's, quote-unquote, going for it, if you will, on some of these free agent moves. And you got to meet one of the biggest signings yesterday, and that's Michael Bennett. Tell me what your impressions were of Michael Bennett yesterday at the NovaCare Complex.
Yeah, I think he's the biggest signing so far, or really trade asset so far, the biggest name they brought in. I came away feeling that he thinks he has a lot left. I kind of wondered what the deal would be with him at 32. They're bringing him into a rotation. Is he just going to take like Bo Allen snaps or some of Vinnie Curry snaps? But I really think it's going to be, I think he's going to want a substantial role here. He talked about fitting into a rotation, but he's not used to doing that. He played a tremendous number of snaps, over 900 snaps last season with plantar fasciitis and some other problems. So I don't know. I'm sure they'll want to rotate him, and I'm sure he's going to be somewhat amenable to that in terms of preserving himself at age 32. But I think he's going to expect to be a starter, and that's going to be real interesting.
And, of course, as a member of the media, you always welcome someone that will help you fill up your notebook. He's extremely quotable.
Yeah, very quotable guy, very thoughtful guy. I think it was important to him to come to a team where, activism and community outreach and things like that are embraced. There was some talk as he was leaving Seattle and Richard Sherman was leaving Seattle that maybe Seattle was a little tired of having guys who were, in the spotlight so much for off-the-field stuff and protests and so forth. Bennett didn't think that was so much the case, but nonetheless, there are teams he could have gone to where that would have been more of a negative than it is here, I think. And I think he's going to be an interesting guy in the locker room and an interesting presence in the community moving forward.
Hey, Les, Pete touched on it momentarily, and that was what the work Howie Roseman has done this offseason. In the past, we've seen teams like the Broncos and the Ravens and others who have won the Super Bowl who have taken a step or two back in terms of roster talent and depth, whereas the Eagles seem like with Roseman, he's very intent on not taking steps back, that he's taking that term defending Super Bowl champion very seriously for the 2018 season with all the moves they made. I want to get your impressions of what Howie Roseman has done overall.
Yeah, I think he's doing, a very tight cap situation. I think and without a lot of draft assets, I think he's doing pretty much everything he can to keep them competitive, and I think they will be very competitive. You mentioned two other teams, the Ravens and the Broncos. With the Ravens, the timing of their Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl win, was such that they had to, that offseason, give Joe Flacco $100 and some million contract, and that really has, I think, crippled them in terms of assets around him and so forth since then. They really haven't drafted very well either. With the Broncos, it was simply the matter of Peyton Manning retiring and them not really having a quarterback going forward, which is certainly not the situation here. But, I don't think anybody expects the Eagles to take a step back. I think they're making the defense, which really, in the Super Bowl exposed some problems there. I think they're making the defense much stronger with the expectation that the offense certainly is going to be okay, especially when Carson Wentz gets back. It's still a very potent group. It's losing Torrey Smith and LeGarrette Blount, but I think those guys can certainly be replaced.
Now the Eagles have made some moves already this offseason. Do you think they're going to focus on whether it's filling the reserve tight end role or maybe adding another wide receiver or the linebacker depth? Do you think that's more of a free agent move at this point, or do you think they're going to start focusing more on the draft moving forward?
That's a good question. We're kind of getting into that second phase of free agency where you're bringing in guys, either high-profile guys on very short-term contracts who just didn't get what they wanted out of free agency, or you're bringing in guys who have been depth guys in other places who aren't well-known, who might nonetheless step up and play a role, a more significant role for you. And I'm interested to see what Howie Roseman does in those areas that you mentioned. I think they certainly need another really good pass-catching tight end to go with Zach Ertz. And I think that could be very well end up being where they go 32nd overall in the first round if they hold on to that pick. I think they need a good young safety to come up behind Malcolm Jenkins and Rodney McLeod. And I think that could very well be a high draft priority. I don't really think you're going to find that guy in free agency. Wide receiver, they definitely need to add to the group there. You know, it's a good group, but it's not a great group. It could be better, especially since Alshon Jeffrey's going to miss the off season and training camp and probably the preseason after shoulder surgery. So I'd kind of like to see them, you know, in the draft or through free agency, find somebody that could be a contributor there, not a superstar, but a contributor, a solid contributor. You know, somebody like Jeremy Maclin might be an answer there. I don't know what they think of him, what his health is, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think there are several depth situations that need to be addressed. Not a lot of starting situations, but certainly depth and special teams that can get a lot better.
Les Bowen with us, the Eagles beat writer for the Philadelphia Daily News. Follow him on Twitter at Les Bowen and Philly.com, and subscribe to the paper too, by the way. That's always an option for you folks out there. Les, before we let you go, Daryl Worley was there yesterday as well. I'd be remiss if we didn't get some of your thoughts on what he brings to the table, especially since the Eagles now with Patrick Robinson have some question marks at corner.
Yeah, you know, I'm really interested to see how this all fits together, Pete. They've got a bunch of corners, but they've lost their nickel guy, the guy that was so dependable there in that spot. I think they kind of wanted to keep him, but he ended up getting a really good deal to go back to New Orleans where he started out. I don't really know Worley very well. I know that he played a lot of snaps in Carolina. He played outside mostly. Frankly, the night that they played the Eagles there in Charlotte, he didn't do very well against the Eagles receivers. I think he did have some problems. He's a big corner. He seems like a really smart guy. Could they move him inside? Could they move him to safety? I don't know the answers to that, but they have a lot of people. I think Sidney Jones is the main guy that, you know, that people tend to forget that's, you know, a top talent who's coming into this situation. And I think he'll probably start. And on the other side, it could be Jalen Mills, could be Ronald Darby if they don't trade Darby for draft picks. And, you know, it's all kind of a big Rasul Douglas. He could go inside. I think he'd be a very good slot corner. But we haven't seen them on the field, obviously. We won't for another month or so until OTAs start. And I'm real curious about how all that comes together and who gets what role. And I don't think we'll know right away. I think it'll be well into the summer before all that gets figured out.
Won't see the Eagles on the field for another month or so, but Les Bowen always on the beat for us, the Philadelphia Daily News beat writer at Les Bowen on Twitter. Les, it's like a renaissance for Philly sports right now. The Sixers look to make the playoffs. Flyers are trying to get in. This Eagles Super Bowl win is rubbing off on everybody.
And Villanova, obviously, in the Sweet 16. So, yeah, it's a great time in Philly sports.
Don't count out the Wildcats. Les, we always love catching up with you, me especially because I go so far back with you from my Temple days in the early 90s when I think you were around the Flyers beat. So good times, my friend, and I thank you so much, and we'll catch up with you again down the road.
Thank you, Pete. Take care.